Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in this conversation today. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication creates our social worlds. And I think this is an important touchstone for us to keep returning to, because what that means for us and what we do because we believe that is always going to be evolving and changing as our own social worlds keep evolving and changing as well. One of the key parts of understanding communication as a way to create better social worlds is to understand communication as a relational process. It's something we do in collaboration with other people. And so the question kind of becomes, what does it look like to effectively communicate in a collaborative way with others? And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go into part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Mike Hemphill today. I'll go ahead and kind of pause right now and direct you back to part 1 of our conversation with Mike. If you haven't listened to that yet, you'll definitely want to listen to that first. But if you already have listened to that one, then we can jump into this conversation. Today we get more into this kind of idea that leadership, which is, Mike's area of expertise, as well as communication, both of these things are not something that we do to other people. It's something that we create with other people. And it's evolving and it's fluid and we're creating it in the moment. I really like where this conversation ends up today. And so I hope you will find some value in that as well, and maybe some new ways of framing your social world as well. To me, this was a really, really great conversation. So let's go ahead and jump right in.
I think something we should mention at this juncture too is, at the same time, we have to recognize that an approach like CMM is not the approach.
Yeah.
And in fact, a cosmopolitan approach to communication must include an understanding of the interactants that a cosmopolitan perspective is not the perspective.
Yeah.
Because what we recognize is there are different modes of communicating. And I think the example that comes to my mind is in my career, as I tried to use CMM in the way that I taught and the way that I interacted with my colleagues, and certainly in my personal life, the way I handled my administrative responsibilities when I was in higher ed administration. And there's a mindfulness that's involved in that. And there's a willingness to understand the different stories that people bring into all the situations you're dealing with. Barnett actually helped me. And I can still remember having this conversation with him when I was facing some really critical administrative challenges, trying to hear all voices, right? Bring everybody into the conversation. And at some point he stopped me and he said, Mike, this is all well and good, but at some point you got to make a decision. I mean, it's like, you can be in a perpetual state of mindfulness trying to get the more complete story.
Yeah.
Let's make a decision and move on. Sure, that's what you should do. And so one of the things we've learned, like in the program I'm co-directing right now, our Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, and we talk about leadership development, and we look at examples from these 4 presidential administrations and the leadership challenges that were faced there. And we hear from members of their administrations. And in the case of President Clinton and President Bush, we hear from them, and they both share the same perspective with us, which is, when you're facing a key decision, you invite smart people into the room, and you debate and you collect information. But as President Bush says frequently, at some point you got to make the decision.
Yeah. But
what they both share with us is the attitude that when you make that decision, not thinking, well, that's it. We don't have to make that. We don't have to deal with that issue anymore. You make this decision to set up the next decision that's going to have to be made with this. And I think that's where, it's one of the challenges, I think for people who are trying to understand CMM. I found that with the students that I've had, like in this last semester, this course I taught, for the longest time, there was this undercurrent of, okay, I'm grasping this, I'm getting this idea, but what am I supposed to do? We're talking about communication and leadership, and we're looking at it from a CMM perspective. okay, I get it conceptually, but tell me, what do I do when I'm in this situation?
Right.
And I kept telling my students, it's what I'm hoping is by the end of the semester, you recognize that's not the question you want to be asking.
Right.
It's not prescriptive in that way.
Yeah.
And that it becomes a part of a broader repertoire of communication competencies that you bring into every conversation.
Yeah. I love to talk about a communication perspective or a communication lens, just because that makes sense to me. And I really do visualize it as like, you go to the eye doctor and they're like, 1 or 2, 1 or 2,
right.
2 or 3. And they're showing you these different lenses, and it's changing what you're seeing. The thing on the other side is not necessarily changing, but the way that you're seeing it through the lens is changing. And so CMM is one of countless lenses or frameworks, I would say, to approach the world, to see the world through. So it's like you're putting on a different pair of glasses, and maybe one moment calls for a CMM perspective. So you put on, quote unquote, your CMM glasses.
Right.
And in another moment, a different perspective is more beneficial to use. But it's like different glasses. You have a tool belt, and, CMM is one of the tools in that tool belt.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah. And CMM allows for that to happen. That's just baked into the perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why I like it so much, is that it does feel so expansive. And that is maybe why I can slippery slope into, all I'll ever need is CMM, and that's the perfect framework for my life, because it feels like it is helpful in so many different situations for me. But, that does not mean that there cannot be other beneficial frameworks. But I think the, beautiful thing about being guided by being CMM-ish is that it leaves its doors open to work hand in hand with so many other things. It's not CMM or this perspective, CMM or something else. It's always, trying to work hand in hand with other things. And I think it lends itself really naturally to that.
It's the both and, not the either or.
Yes.
That's a main reason why I've always stressed, like in our program and in my classes, I've always stressed the importance of reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Those standard sort of CMM questions of, what are we making? How are we making it?
Mm-hmm.
How will we make it better?
Yeah.
The notion of developing your capacity for mindfulness, in the moment mindfulness, is so dependent upon reflection that it becomes for me, it becomes reflection becomes a critical leadership practice for people. And, even going back to my public, I don't know, I was going to talk about public speaking so much on this, but I go back to my classes where I taught public speaking, where I knew my students, after they finished that required assignment, would sit down and think to themselves, thank God that's over. I'm never doing that again. Right.
Yeah.
I got it over with. But I'd always tell them, you sit down and you should think to yourself, what am I going to do differently next time? Because there will be a next time.
Right.
And how important to frame things in terms of, I want to think about, later on with CMM, I kind of rephrase the question of, what did we make?
Yeah.
So when you have those moments where you have to make the tough decision, or you have to, I always said that the times you need to practice leadership most effectively are almost always the times you don't want to.
Yeah.
Because you have to, you have to make a tough decision, or you have to give bad news to somebody, or negative feedback to someone, or whatever it may be. And those are really, really challenging. Those are challenging moments in our lives.
You're making me think, use the language of communication is not something that we do to someone else. And I know that you've used that same kind of language around, like, leadership is not something that you do to other people.
Right.
So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, what your perspective and your experience with leadership is.
Yeah. Well, that's the starting point for me. And Kim and Barnett Pierce really helped us a lot in the early years of the Clinton School of Public Service, where we had the first master's degree in public service. And it was very reflective of the Clinton legacy of, sort of grassroots, face-to-face, community change, public service. One of the things I would tell the students is that at the Clinton School, we didn't treat public service as something that you do to somebody. It's something that emerges because of our interactions with others.
Yeah.
And in a more nuanced way, then it was one of the things that we wanted to do for them as students in our program was to give them the capacity to create the types of frameworks that would encourage the types of interactions that would lead to the sorts of changes that were beneficial to a community, depending on whether the specific issue or challenges they were facing.
Right.
And I think that carries over to this mindset of leadership in the same way, that leadership is not, and again, it's a reification. It's not something you have. It's not something you have more or less of, although we have a tendency to think of it in those terms.
Yeah.
Leadership is really the result, the process of this interaction that we have. And here, I don't know if this is going to make sense or not, but I think what's happened is that in reifying leadership, what we do is we tend to see the person. I don't know, you see if this makes sense to you. If you think about somebody that you consider to be a strong leader or someone who exercised strong leadership in a particular situation, my sense is that almost always those are the individuals that somehow were able to influence the framework of the interaction in such a way that challenges were faced, problems were solved, things moved forward in some particular way. Now, their ability to influence those frameworks may be because of their expertise. It may be because of their charisma. It may be because of their hierarchical position in the power hierarchy of an organization. Be a lot of reasons why and it could be because they have an authentic, I think what we used to call in leadership, an authentic transformational approach to leadership, where they saw that we're in this together and our goal is for all of us to be involved and to improve as we face these challenges. I feel that way. I feel so strongly about it that I work really, really hard to never use the word leader in our leadership program, to not refer to our participants as leaders. Yeah. I will every once in a while, but I really work hard not to, because I think that term suggests there's something about the individual. Yeah, right. That gives them that status when that's not the case at all. And so if we look at leadership as this process, then the question shifts from what do I need to do to what do we need to do? And then looking at that process as what's generating the change or what's helping us face those challenges. It's in a way, and I think some of the participants in our program feel this way, it's kind of a liberating perspective. It's complicated, like you said. It's like you mentioned earlier, it's this rich, complicated, base of interaction that we're getting into. But at the same time, it lifts the responsibility from the individual. Now, going back to Barnett's advice to me, it also recognizes that in certain contexts, we need that one person to have that responsibility. Yeah. A number of years ago, I had a kidney stones and go to the emergency room. That's not the moment I want fourth level of mindfulness from my doctor. Just please tell me what something. Yeah. Just do it. But we approach leadership as truly as, interacting with others in order to get things done. And I'm just going to share this with you real quick because it really illustrates this point. I used to say in our program that was a leadership development program in which we looked at how the quality of the interactions with others helped us to make the world a better place. And had one of our participants, when I mentioned that one time, say, but yeah, whose definition of better? And I was like, wow. I mean, that's it, right? Because oftentimes we think of leadership in the standard, look through the process. Yeah. And I have my end state in mind, and now I just got to get you. But there's a lot more to that saying that, leadership is about finding what direction people are going and then running ahead of them. What's overlooked in that statement oftentimes is that what leadership requires is to understand that those that you're interacting with are heading in a direction. Yeah. And it's silly to not recognize that. I used to liken leadership to parachuting onto one horse in a stampeding herd, and that the herd's on it's moving. Yeah. And yeah. You get on that one horse and you can influence and impact in some way the direction, but it really is about what how are we going to approach this challenge? And it can be a real liberating perspective to take. And it gives you the entree then to take a lot of the CMM notions and bring them into and focus on the issues that you're facing in your leadership.
There's two things you're making me think. One is that everything you just said feels like a big nod back to what you were saying about the beginning about the coordination of it all, the collaboration that is innate and, you can't be denied. It's just innately a part of the communication, leadership, life. There's always that coordination. And then kind of sounds like the same conversation you're trying to have around leadership is part of what I'm trying to do around talking about creativity, because I think some people could be like, oh, I'm a creative person, or I'm just not a creative person. It's in the same way you could hear someone say, well, I'm a leader, or someone say, I'm just not a leader. I don't want to use those words in that way.
Yeah, right,
it's creativity is not a quality you have or you don't have. It's like up for the taking for anybody in the same way leadership is, if you're, kind of cultivating it, I guess. And I think, it's liberating. It's more expansive. It just feels like more helpful to think about those concepts in that way for it to be emerging, for it, and maybe part of why we cling to saying definitive statements about ourselves, like I'm a leader or I'm not creative, is because it goes back to that illusion of stability.
Yeah.
Because if you can't use that language in that way and you're like, well, sometimes I'm creative and sometimes I'm a leader, that's a little, unstable. I think we are really, drawn to who am I and what definitive statements can I make about myself? Because we want to know ourselves. We want to understand ourselves. It's why we do reflection. But that's why we're also not, okay, we did our reflection and now we're moving on. We're always reflecting and doing that work because we're always changing and there's always new things to reflect on.
You're making me think of a couple things. One is there came a point in my career where I started, like in the job hiring process, so you're a department chair and you've got a faculty position open and you post the ad and, 50 or 60 or 100 people, whatever, they apply for the job. And, the standard approach then is that you go through the applications and you rate them in some way, then you rank them. Mm-hmm. And we had a system in place on our campus, like many, many other campuses, where the dean and the provost and the chancellor said, give us your top three, or, but it was this sort of rank ordering thing.
Yeah. And
there came a point where I realized that in most job searches are conducted within the myth of the best candidate.
Yeah.
The myth that in any one pool of applicants, there is a best candidate.
Yeah.
And when you think about, when you hear the conversations that have resurfaced here recently about affirmative action, and it is all based on the notion that you shouldn't do anything that interferes with the best candidate getting the job, as if we know in advance who the best candidate is. And the difference, which we sort of evolved into, which was to look at the applicant pool in terms of who are the people that are demonstrating a capacity to become a really good faculty member for us at some point. Mm-hmm. And we do the same thing in our program. Our participants are stunned to find out, we have 500 to 600 applications a year for our program, and we pick 60 people. So it's a pretty competitive process.
Yeah.
They are surprised to find out that we don't rank order people and take the top 60. We really do. Yeah. We maximize the diversity of the group at every stage of selection. And then after we've done our final interviews, we put together a lot of different groups of 60 and sort of see how they look like.
Yeah.
And then once we're done, and this is the great CMM thing, is that once we've selected a cohort, then what I challenge everybody involved in the program to do is let's make this the best cohort.
Yep.
We're not picking the best people because we didn't look at it. We didn't rank them in those terms. We ranked them for their capacity to grow in their leadership. And now that we've got them, let's make this something special for this group of people. As Kim says, I've heard her, she used to tell our students before we go do community dialogues, our students would be really worried about, what if nobody shows up? We've done all this work. What if nobody comes? And Kim would say, don't worry about it. The right people are always there.
Yeah.
This is what, you'll make this into the experience that it can be,
right,
with whoever is there.
Yeah. The first thing I'm thinking is that that's obviously a much more complex way to go about hiring or, sifting through hundreds of applicants. But again, it is more reflective of what is equally complex of all of those human beings on the other end of those
Right.
applications,
Yes.
and those
Yeah.
complex dynamics and their complex stories. And again, you reference their capacities that it's not coming across maybe on a resume. And so again, I think it's one of those, yes, it's more challenging, but maybe it is worth leaning into those more challenging, those more complex, those more, mental or time or energy consuming things to be a more appropriate response. Because my biggest pet peeve is like the oversimplifying of complex things. I can understand why we do it because, we want it to, fit into the palm of our hand. And maybe that's why I'm looking for a simpler explanation or definition of communication,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
I want something to kind of hold on to. But it would also be a disservice to oversimplify.
So my wife and I are getting ready to, in 4 weeks, we have our 50th high school reunion,
Uh-huh.
which doesn't even seem possible. We graduated, she and I graduated. We didn't know each other in high school, but we graduated from the same high school.
Funny.
And so high school reunions are really interesting to me because I'm going to see people. In fact, she was just telling me, she was looking at the list of people who RSVP'd. And so there are people coming to this reunion that have not been to any of our other reunions.
Yeah.
So there are people that are coming to this reunion that I have not seen in 50 years. And as she's reading off the names of these people, the meanings that are being generated within me are all rooted in
50-year-old memories.
In their 18-year-old selves.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think going back to the leadership notion, this process of interacting with others, this illusion that oftentimes we put on ourselves, right? That we have to understand we also put that illusion, that symbolic static representation of other people on them.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't reckon like going to the reunion and expecting the 68-year-old to be the 18-year-old.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Yet at the same time, it's exactly what it's just what your brain does.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think who it is. I think it's Arthur Jensen in his book. There's this notion of, in this cosmopolitan perspective, is that you let, when you're in these challenging conversations, you let the emotions permeate. You don't hold on to the emotions. You don't let them fester.
Yeah.
You don't ignore them. You just let them. And I love this vision of just let it permeate. Well, in my sense making, that's that illusion of stability, right? That is that whoever that was that wrote that. When I read that, what I thought was, what you're saying is don't artificially symbolically freeze that as this emotion, anger, bad, or as don't frame it as an argument that needs a response. One of the things we talk about in our leadership program is the kind of collaborative leadership that we talk about in our program. We work at creating frameworks of interaction that allow us to understand the other person without feeling any obligation to agree with them.
Yeah.
And so this notion of letting your feelings permeate, just resist the urge to freeze it and label it as something.
Yeah.
And just stay focused on understanding. And that becomes a really critical, I think, aspect of your leadership, is your ability to do that with yourself, but to do it with other people as well. And then after these challenging leadership moments, that's one of the things you should reflect on, is how well did I do that? How well, and you might think of it as suspend judgment or however you want it, but I love that notion of just to let those emotions permeate, to let your judgment, to let your meaning permeate, means you recognize that it's there.
Yeah.
But you recognize there's more to it. There's that mystery to it. And then at some point, you are going to freeze it and label it and say, this is what it is. So we can so that we can tell the story about it later. I mean, you've got to. If we didn't, we never would tell the stories. We wouldn't have a way of telling the stories. We'd just be living them all the time. Yeah. And that's just provided me with a different insight into the leadership process.
Well, what I think you're talking about is, one of my favorite concepts that I learned in studying communication, of the idea of pluralistic truths, which, shows up in CMM and a number of other, but you can exist in this tension between my truth and your truth being two entirely different things and absolutely coexisting.
Right.
And again, that's an ask of people to lean into a more complex understanding of the world, you know?
Yeah.
It's easier to say, this is the truth. This is the way we all function. This is what we all know to be true. But again, that's an oversimplification. There's so many different ways of being human. And even when I talk about effective communication, so many different ways to do that. When you talk about leadership, there's so many different ways to be an effective leader. There's not a one size fits all,
Right.
quote unquote, capital T truth of the situation. I would love to kind of transition into the last thing that I love to talk about with my guests, which, you know, is maybe an opportunity to kind of recap some of the things we already talked about. I just want to be using the CMM frame of a better social world. And I know that you've already, you know, mentioned that in other conversations, people have already asked of you, well, how do you define better? But in this conversation, I want to use those same kind of terms and say, you know, how do you define a better social world? And then a follow-up to that being, how do you feel like you're working towards that, maybe personally or professionally as an educator and with your work with the Clinton Foundation and the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's a hard one to answer. This is a harder one for me to answer than you know, trying to define communication and what the better social world is.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder, you know, so for me, again, I feel personally this same kind of gravitational pull towards, you know, a predictive model. You know, do we predefine what better means? What a better world was.
Yeah. We might not know what a better world is until we're in it, in a way.
Yeah. Or is another way of thinking about it, you know, do we mindfully respond and react to the worlds that we're creating in our interactions with other people in a way that make them better?
Yeah. I think it's another both and, right?
Yes.
We're both leaving room for the better social world to emerge, and we are spending some time playing around with what we think it looks like.
Yeah. If there's any current participant or any of the alumni of Presidential Leadership Scholars listening to this, they'd be very disappointed if at this point I didn't say that one of my most frequent sayings in our PLS program is that the journey is the destination.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about the better social world, which I think is what that scholar that when was pushing back with me about, but who gets to define what's better, is the point that he was really making, which is that, you know, we don't predefine what better is. The idea is that do we create the kinds of interaction frameworks that allow for people to actively engage in co-authoring the social worlds, and are we working actively towards making what it is we are creating to be of benefit to solve the problem that we're facing, to find ways of facing the challenges that we're facing, not defining an outcome that's out there somewhere that we're getting to, and then once we get there, we've succeeded.
Yep.
But rather to recognize that at every turn of the conversation, we have an opportunity to frame that in terms of the better social worlds that we're wanting to make. It doesn't eliminate the fact that we have, in many, many instances, we have very specific outcomes that we're working towards.
Mm-hmm.
We have objectives that we want to achieve. We have metrics that need to be met in some way or another.
Yeah.
The question of leadership is not, you know, do we have those? Although sometimes part of leadership is creating those if they're not there. But the challenge of leadership then is, how do we structure our interactions with one another that will create a social world that is closer to achieving that objective, maybe in a way that we never would have anticipated if we didn't create the kind of frameworks we created for interaction. My first year at the Clinton School, our students did summer projects and capstone projects. And we had one of our students went out to a small town in eastern Arkansas in the Mississippi River Delta region of the state, extremely poor part of the state, went to this small community where the community had been engaged in dialogue about improving their city And in fact, we had taken the whole class out there earlier with Kim and Barnett Pierce to conduct some of these conversations. She went back because she wanted to continue the conversation. And you always hear people say, when you get in those situations, you should ask, who hasn't been invited into the conversation that should have been? And what I told my students was, what you should ask is, who hasn't been invited into the conversation? Forget the who should have been part, because
right.
that suggests that
some people shouldn't.
That you're already imposing some sort of bias about who should be in the conversation. So she asked that question, and one of the responses we got is, we've never asked kids. And so she did her project with, I think they were fifth graders.
Wow.
In this small town. She spent time with them, and she basically asked them, when you think about this town when you're 21 years old, what's it like? And so they came up with all their ideas. And then I think what she did, she hired somebody where the kids created a kind of a picture of it. And it was going to be a mural on the, this is the vision that 10-year-olds in this town have of what it's going to be like when they're 21 years old. And I remember somebody telling me, I think it was somebody from the town told me that they thought it was the first time in a long time that any adult had talked to a 10-year-old in that town with the expectation that they would still be there when they were 21 years old. Because the history of that town was when kids graduated high school, they left and they never came back. Yeah. And just the fact that she had that conversation with them, sort of changed everybody's idea about what a better social world is. Yeah. They never would have encountered on their own. And so from my perspective is, that's a great example of not defining what the outcome is in terms of, this is what this town should be like in 15 years now, how do we get there? Versus, we want it to be better. Let's engage people in conversations that along the way show us both what it is we want it to be and what it is we need to do to get it there. But is constantly allowing us to re-examine, as we learn more and we do more, the ways in which what we want it to be might change. And so I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but history in this country has shown us time and time again that people fight to gain their rights, to a wide variety of things. And when they succeed in that, all that basically does is just, it advances us towards that goal. But generally, it's the great, heuristic value of conversation, the heuristic value of communication, that in answering the questions, we generate more questions. Yeah. And achieving our rights, and achieving our voting rights, it just opens up questions now about the nuances of that and the other ways in which things can happen. I mean, time and time and time again, that it's the journey that should be our focus. And so when in CMN, when we talk about looking at communication and not through it, in my mind, I always say I'm looking at it. I can, it's kind of translucent. I can see through it. I know where we're going. Yeah. But I'm not going to get so locked in on what that's supposed to be that I'm not going to allow this to change and modify and be constantly thinking about, what are we making? How are we making it? How do we make it better? And part of that is the natural evolution and change of the end state that we're aspiring to. In leadership, it runs contrary to the way most people have been taught about, the leadership is, especially in today's society where I feel like we've come to this point where we think obstinance is leadership. Stubbornness is leadership. The stronger you are in digging your feet in and resisting any is the sign of strong leadership. Not allowing any deliberation about your ideas is a sign of strong leadership. And that is so focused on the destination and not the journey. Yep. That there's not much benefit to that.
Absolutely. I appreciate you kind of, wrapping up with this idea of that the journey is the destination, because it's contextualizing the rest of this conversation in a really cool way for me, because I'm kind of hearing when you say the journey is the destination is another way of saying communication for communication's sake, And the third one I'd add to that, which I think is, what I'm hearing you saying is a better world for a better social world's sake, or, the better social world is made through making a better social world. I don't know exactly the right wording for that, but in that same vein of we create a better social world in the trying to create a better social world. It emerges and it's its own reward in a way.
When you're in this line of work, you have a lot of occasions people come to you advice, about how to communicate. My students have done that over the years. And I've had friends and students, come to me where they're facing really, really critical decisions, career choices, getting married, whatever it may be. I mean, they're really sort of obvious, explicit bifurcating moments in their lives, right? And trying to decide. And I get a sense from people that oftentimes the way they approach those decisions is, I want to make the choice that's going to work, as opposed to making the choice and then making it work. Which is, when I hear you say communicating for communication's sake, that's what I take away from it. That's what resonates with me, is not that you make flippant decisions on those, but you do take into account all the things but that you are also always reminding yourself that when I make this decision, then the job becomes making that decision work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's going to require the same level of attention and interaction and mindfulness and reflection. The trap is thinking, oh, I've made the decision, so now let's see if it works, and sitting back. And
right.
Oftentimes then when you do that, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And people say, oh, I should have made a different choice. And it's like, no, maybe you should have worked a little harder at making the choice you made work.
Yeah. Well, you talk about those bifurcation points, and there's, you said, maybe there's some classic examples of big life choices a lot of people face. But again, like those smaller moments, it's like showing up in the small moments can be just as important as the big moments, or, enough small moments become the big moments.
It's like you've been in my classes. So when I would tell my students, the times you need to exercise leadership are usually the times you don't want to, because the moment is so big. Well, the corollary to that then is the time to practice. Is when the stakes aren't so high.
Because it matters then too, but
it does.
It's maybe easier. Try out some new choices in those small moments. Yeah.
And to reflect on the choices that you did make in the small moments.
I'm thinking of like an Olympian, like you wouldn't go try something out on the beam if you're a gymnast for the first time at the Olympics.
Right.
In front of the whole world. You'd practice that in your, own gym for a long time before that.
Yeah. And maybe not 4 feet off the ground, maybe 6 inches off the ground.
Yes.
I think about my wife and I used to engage in this hangry episode. So my wife and I have been married for 46 years. And early on, we used to have this hangry episode that we would do. Usually after a day of driving around, maybe we skipped lunch or whatever, it was getting time for dinner, and we were both really hungry. And it's one of these things where one of us would go, oh, I'm hungry. You want to go out to eat? Yeah. Where do you want to go? I don't care anywhere you want to go. And then, I don't care. Where do you want? No, you decide. No, you decide. And then somebody would say someplace. And then the next response was, no, I don't want it. Let's make a change. No, I don't want Chinese.
Yeah.
And then this became so routine for us that we developed this rule in our relationship, which was, if we've gone back and forth like this and somebody suggests a place and the other person doesn't accept it, then that relieves the originator of any responsibilities for picking out where to go. So now it's all on you to decide. That's funny. So one time we're driving around and I say to my wife, it's getting late and we're both hungry. And I say, I'm getting hungry. You want to go out to eat? And she says, yeah. She says, where do you want to go? And I said, I don't care. Where do you want to go? And there's this pause and she looks at me and she says, we both know where this conversation is going to go. She just called it out, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
We know where this is going.
That's good meta communicating right there.
Exactly. And so let's not go there. And gave us a whole different perspective on exchange. But it was such in many, many ways, right? I mean, you would hope that in the course of marriage, the worst thing you ever had to deal with is trying to figure out where to go out to eat.
Yeah.
But in that moment, it was such a great learning because it relates to so many other things, that the way we talked about other things.
Absolutely.
You can sort of see that it's an exemplar for other interactions we have.
A good small moment of practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And reflection. Yeah. Just that small moment of,
Mm-hmm. My boyfriend and I both grew up in families where maybe other members of our families were like overly accommodating. And so kind of by default, we were like the decision makers, I'm just going to have an opinion because no one else will. And so we both are very familiar with like decision fatigue. And so what we do when we're trying to decide where to go eat is say one person's going to say 3 options and then the other person's going to pick from that. So you both have a role in the picking.
Well, that's awesome.
You don't have to throw one out and think that the other person is only saying that they'll go because you want to go. Because if you said the original 3 and I picked from that 3, I know you wanted that at least 33%. And that helps. And again, it applies to bigger things because then, we traveled together for 6 months after we graduated in May. And we were able to have bigger conversations about decision fatigue when I was like, we are making plans every moment of every day for 6 months straight. And I'm able to say, hey, remember that conversation about picking a place to eat and the decision fatigue we both experience on something that small? I'm getting a little decision fatigued about where we're going to stay next and how we're going to spend our money and what country we're about to go to.
Right. Yeah.
And it's those small moments help you have language and help you practice for those bigger moments.
That's a great example. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's helpful. It works. It works. And I share it with anyone I can. Yeah.
That's like we had friends that she had 2 boys close in age, and they would fight over like the last piece of cake or whatever.
Yeah.
And they would always ask her to cut it evenly. And her response, and I'm sure other people have come up with this because she was the first person I ever heard do this. Her response was she'd give the knife to one of them, say, you cut it into 2 pieces and your brother gets to pick the first piece.
Yeah, that's good.
And she would say, you've never seen a more meticulous assessment of slicing a piece of cake. So
good. That's
Isn't that
so
great?
Good.
Yeah.
Yep.
But it's the same deal. Then you think I can see extending that into bigger issues. Yeah.
It's collaboration.
It is.
It's all full circle.
That's great.
That's amazing. Great. Wow. Well, Mike, I really appreciate your time today and all of your insights. I feel like this has been a really rich conversation for me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Abbie. I've enjoyed it too. It's been a lot of fun, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you today.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Dr. Mike Hemphill. Such a treat to get to talk to him, and definitely some wisdom to be gained from this conversation. The next turns that I'm thinking of after this conversation that I hope might apply to you as well are to keep thinking about some of that language that we talked about right at the end that ended up being the kind of culmination of this conversation, of these kind of ideas that go hand in hand or are just different ways to say the same concept, which is that the journey is the destination, or that we're practicing communication for communication's own sake, that we're creating our better social worlds in trying to create the better social worlds, that is just something that happens along the way. I'm so glad that we ended up talking about patterns at the end of this too, and even if it's just the simple decisions of relationships like where to eat or any other small daily decision that kind of fits that pattern, I hope that you will maybe borrow some of the ideas that we shared about how to better manage those patterns and make those decisions in collaboration with each other. As always, I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many, many initiatives that they work on that is just so cool, and all of it is rooted in the idea of creating a better social world through communication, which is something I certainly want to be a part of, and I hope that you will want to be a part of as well. Okay, and last but not least, I love to give you some next turns for the podcast specifically, and of course that includes leaving a rating or a review if you haven't done that already. That takes 1 minute to do, super easy, and is super helpful for me and getting the podcast in front of more people so we can bring more people into this community. Another great way to do that is to share episodes with people that you want to invite into this conversation. You can also get in contact with me so we can keep our own conversation going. You can do that on Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod, on YouTube at storieslived.storietold, or you can contact me through the website, which is storieslived.storietold.com. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told. Bye.